Okay, so why migrate? Well, from an economic sense, it's very simple. So if your wages are higher in the US minus the cost of travel, if this what your return is in the US is greater than your wages in the home country, boom, let's go. Um, so if you just put it in pure economic terms, it's pretty simple. Now, we can load in other concerns to this cost of travel. So you can say, okay, what is the psychological toll of moving your family or moving yourself all the way to a new country? Or we can add that into the cost of travel, and that could change based on if you have existing networks, if you have existing family. So we can include kind of that in the cost of travel. We can also include cultural costs, like how different is the US culture from your culture. Do you have to learn English, or do you already speak English? So all those sorts of like non-monetary costs, like theoretically we could load into this model, and it would get us a long way in terms of explaining why people come to the US, when they come to the US, who from a particular sending country comes. And so it's not going to be perfect, but we could do a pretty good job predicting and explaining travel. Of course, this cost of these cost little variable here is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, or could be doing a lot of lifting. And generally we can analyze changes over time. So the big change initially is that the cost of travel really falls precipitously from the 1700s through the 1800s. And so essentially a lot of that travel initially, that indentured servitude travel. So the way indentured servitude works is um, you essentially agree to work for somebody for a period of time. All right. Usually, 7 years. And so the ship captain essentially takes that contract. You write a contract, the ship captain takes your contract. The ship captain then takes you to the colonies and then sells the contract. So there's no money up front. You don't need to raise any money up front. You essentially just agree to this arrangement, and then the ship captain is basically taking the risk. The ship captain is taking the risk, bringing you to the colonies, selling the contract. Now, the time to earn the fare in terms of how long it takes to work, well, if it takes me 4 years to earn the fare, for many people they're going to opt for the indentured servitude option. Now if it takes 4 weeks, well, I'll just save and then travel. And so this is the big change. All of a sudden it becomes affordable to get to the US. I mean, in the present, obviously it's incredibly affordable, or much more affordable than it was in the past. But you have to understand what the context of the 1700s. It wasn't so easy just to pack up financially. It wasn't so easy to pack up and go to the US. And so that's why these type of contracts existed. Those go away just for economic reasons. And so another way we can look at this is economic conditions in the home country versus the U.S. And so we should basically, what we also see is when times are hard in European sending countries, we see much more migration to the U.S. Conversely, when times are bad in the U.S., you see much less migration. So if you combine those factors, if times are good in the U.S. and times are bad in European centric countries, that's when you're really going to get the migration. And so you see this in the Russian migrations. All right, this is Russian data. See the Russian economy crashing here. You see the U.S. economy expanding in this period, and this is when you get your flow of migrants. Similar thing with the Irish potato famine engenders a lot of migration to the U.S. I always, I would always argue a lot about immigration with my grandma, who was fairly anti-immigration, although surprisingly, she hosted over 50 exchange students who most of the vast majority became U.S. citizens. So, not sure how to square that circle, but so she's very anti-immigration, and yet she hosted, many of my extended family members are exchange students that live with them for years. But anyways, whatever. She's anti-immigration, and I always say, Grandma, if you don't want immigrants, it's very, very easy. If you don't want immigrants to the US, it's very easy. Crash the US economy and you will see less people coming here. In fact, we had such an experiment with the 2008 financial crisis. If you look at flows to the US, they essentially went negative. They went net negative after the financial crisis. So I said, Grandma, hey, look, You don't want immigrants. All you need to do is support policies that crash the economy. There you go. I'm joking. I'm joking, of course. Um, okay, so who migrates? So we covered why migrate, and so also, and then you have economic factors, but there's also political factors, persecution factors as well. So you have refugees who also come to the U.S. When it becomes politically untenable for them in their home country. So you have a wave of this happens throughout history. So of course you have the wave of Cuban immigrants to Florida post Castro. And then you have the Memorial boat lift as well, which is another, some more dissidents coming from Cuba. Of course, you have post Vietnam War, you have lots of South Vietnamese coming to the U.S. My wife's family, they're an ethnic minority of Vietnam, and so post Vietnam War, my father in law fought for the South. He's, scariest man alive. He was shot 16 times total in the Vietnam War. He was actually in the war before the Americans got involved. So he's in the war for a long time. He was shot numerous times. When he has his shirt off, which is all the time because he's in his 80s, and that's just how he is. Just there's just scars, just bullet scars all through here. And so, post Vietnam War, after the South and the U.S. are defeated by the North, um, the North sent basically people to kill him. And so, my wife's brother, his earliest memories is a sniper on the hill, shooting at them. Basically, they're hanging laundry, and the bullets start whizzing by. So, this refugee or fleeing persecution, that certainly describes immigrant experience. Describes my wife's family. So they fled Vietnam to Cambodia, and then Pol Pot came to power and committed a genocide against their particular ethnic minority. I mean, there was many people killed by Pol Pot, but there was definitely a genocidal component to the people killed during Pol Pot's reign. Her ethnic minority being one of them. So then they had to flee Cambodia. They fled. Through basically through the southern border, um, even though it was mined. So if you know anything about Cambodian history, they mined the borders to keep people in. Um, Robbers, bandits on the trail, those sort of thing, made it to a refugee camp on the Thai border, and then eventually were granted asylum in the U.S. So I don't know why I told the whole story, but just the political refugees are definitely another reason. And you could, again, with our crude economic model, you could put that in there as part of the cost. As essentially the cost is on this side, for staying in your home country if you're being severely persecuted, or in my wife's family's case, actually actively hunted down by both governments, trying to kill them. The Pol Pot's regime rounded up their people, village by village. Um, anyways, so who migrates? So typically, we can look at the characteristics of the migrants. So your first generation migrants are going to be people foreign born. So there's a bit of confusion about like what the colloquialisms are in terms of who's first generation, who's second generation. The formal definition is first generation's foreign born, and then the generation born in the U.S. would be the second generation. But many people who are second generation consider themselves first generation, as then the first generation in the U.S. In this class, this is the foreign born. This is the generation born in the U.S. Even though, so for my wife's example, her parents would be the first generation. She would be the second generation, although she's technically was born in the refugee camp. My mother-in-law was actually pregnant with her the whole time. They're fleeing, the mines, the bandits. She was actually 8 months pregnant when all that was going on, with my wife. And so, anyways, so my wife would technically be second generation since she came here before, when she was young. Anyways, all right. And so you see, just these are general, these are the characteristics of the various of the people who come to the U.S. All right, this is going to be averages across many countries, so there's not going to be much to be gleaned here. Now, one of the typical concerns about immigration that you hear is like, immigrants are less educated. That is a concern that is voiced by people about immigrants. And it's true that on average, your immigrants typically have lower levels of educational attainment. But that really isn't the relevant question. The relevant question would be, you know, are because the U.S. has high levels of educational attainment, on average. So, just in general, if you were to take a U.S. citizen and compare them to a citizen from another country, they're likely to have a higher level of educational attainment. The real question is, sorry, why is this not the next slide? Here we go. The real question is, what does the migrant population look like relative to their own country? And so this is the share of more educated among the migrants, share of more educated among the population. What this is picking up is basically, so take the Taiwan, all right? This is saying, what is the share of more educated? So this is 13 plus years of schooling amongst people in Taiwan. So it's about whatever that is, zero point 0.2 something. All right. So about 25% of the population in Taiwan has education of 13 plus years in 2000. Of immigrants to the US from Taiwan, what percentage of them have 13 plus years of schooling? Almost 80%. So basically, above this line, immigrants to the US will have from that country, so Cyprus, Austria, Luxembourg, etc. Basically, every sending country to the US, with the exception of maybe Bulgaria, every sending country, people coming to the U.S. are more educated than on average than their country. So what this says is this is what's called positive selection. That the U.S. is essentially getting people from the top of the educational distribution from their home country. So this kind of charge that immigrants are, less educated. Well, relative to the U.S. on average, yes, but relative to their home country, it's the more educated are coming here. Okay, so what pushes people to migrate? What pulls them? So we talked about this. We talked about kind of the push-pull factors, positively or negatively selected. So this is just a big question in the literature. You may say, why do we care about this? Maybe we don't care about this, but it is a question kind of ongoing in the literature and in the political discourse. Best and the brightest versus um, the less educated of the population. So, but this is an empirical question. We can go and look at the data and see what the data tells us. In push factors, we have the relative wages, which we talked about, famine, political persecution, relative employment factors. So these are all what we talked about. Pull factors in the U.S. Again, relative wages. Are wages good here? Are you more likely to get a job? And then also another pull factor to the U.S. is going to be what is this? What does the existing network look like? What does you know the cost of travel are much lower. The cost of not assimilation, but the cost of coming here and establishing yourself are much lower if there is an existing network. Again, going back to my wife's family, there was no network. They're very, very small ethnic minority. It's only a couple 100,000 of them in the entire world. Certainly none in the U.S. pre the Vietnam War. And so, actually, in the refugee camp, my father-in-law went around to all of the people. The ethnic group is named Cham, Cham, and he said, "Let's all, when we go to the U.S., let's all change our last name to Cham, Cham. That way, when we get there, obviously this is like the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. There's not like the internet or stuff like that, but there was the phone book. So he says, if we all change our last name to the same last name, we'll be able to find each other really easily in the phone book. This is a way of establishing an initial network in the U.S., being able to find people from the same background. Anyways, so our question is, our question about migrant selection is, which part of the distribution is being sent? Okay, is it a brain drain? Are we getting the top scientists and that sort of thing, as we did prior to World War II, as many of the top scientists fled the continental Europe, or as the Statue of Liberty's poem supposes, are we getting the poor, the tired, the huddled masses? Are we kind of getting the poorest people from that country? Now, we can go through history the data, look at the data on migration and figure this out. Now, it turns out since 2000, as I've covered, it's largely positive selection. That the top of the distribution, the most educated, are those that are coming to the U.S. That initial wave, 1850, is basically about the middle of the distribution. Essentially, the poor of the distribution, the bottom of the distribution, the low income earners, the low income households, in 1850 were priced out of coming to the U.S. due to the high costs of travel. And for the wealthy, well, the wealthy, were living fine in the home country, and they didn't want to come. So the middle of the distribution came. Now, in the late 1800s, it's largely negative selection in that because now the cost of coming to the US had fallen so far, it was really the low skilled workers that came to the US. That those waves of European late 1800s European immigrants were really the low skilled workers that were coming to the booming economy. Remember, this is when the US is really booming from like basically 1870 through the beginning of the 1900s is really when the US is experiencing um, you know kind of unprecedented levels of growth, very high wages, especially relative to the home country. Now that the cost of travel has fell, we get the low skilled migration. Going to the positive selection in the present, so what is happening is you have that preference for high skilled workers, those visas, but you also have the current system, kind of the post 1965 system, is very complicated to navigate. Kind of the labyrinth of the bureaucracy of the U.S. immigration system. Anybody who's gone through it, it's very difficult. Um, and so typically those from the higher incomes are more equipped to facilitate that navigation, which is why we think there's positive selection in the present. So here we have the positive selection. We already showed you this. 1850s. Here is the evidence for this. So this is the representation, basically a percentage of migrants in a category versus the percentage of the population in the category. So basically, what we're doing is we're looking at, say, German migrants, and we're saying, okay, what is the percentage of German migrants? Of we go to the U.S., what percentage is our bakers? When we go to the home country, what percentage are bakers? And so that ratio is 170. So basically, if this was 100, then it would be basically perfectly equal. And so you can see the overrepresentation of kind of this sort of middle of the occupational distribution. Norway. All right, this is a similar index. Again, basically, we're taking the occupations because back when you go to the 1900, you don't have income data. You don't even have education data. All you really have is occupation, and so you have to kind of infer the SES, the socioeconomic status, based on the occupation. And so when we go back to 1900, when we look at Norwegian immigrants, what you can see is they're overwhelming from the bottom of the occupational rank. Okay. So this is Norwegians basically in the U.S. This is what this is what the distribution looks like. So they're concentrated here, whereas back in Norway, the people in Norway are concentrated at the top of the distribution. So what this tells us is very painstakingly done by Abernensky, Leah Bustan, and Catherine Erickson. What this tells us is negative selection. So basically, we have intermediate selection, then negative selection as the U.S. booms and is attracting low wage workers, low wage, relative to the U.S. wages, but high wages relative to the home country, and then in the present, positive selection. Okay, as I mentioned, one of the things maybe driving positive selection in the present is just the difficulty managing that bureaucracy. All right, now in terms of the wage concerns. When we talk thinking about, okay, how do immigrants affect wages in this time period when we had massive negative selection, massive low skilled migration, you actually do see an impact of immigrants on wages. That's not true in the present. So in the present, most of the research shows limited impact of immigrants on native wages. But in this time period, you actually did see a negative impact. This work according to Claudia Golden.